Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Sunday virtual classes of the BYU Family History Library in Provo, Utah. Our second class this afternoon will be on Researching Your Adopted Ancestors by James Tanner. James has an extensive background in family history and genealogical research and is willing to share his methods with us and tips on this subject. So I'll now turn the time over to him.
We're going to be talking about researching your adopted ancestors. Now, technically your parents are ancestors, but I'm not going to focus particularly on immediate family relationships. But any of the principles, all of the principles and any and all of the principles I talk about during the presentation will apply to any adopted person and the type of search that you need to make in order to have that to be successful. First of all, understand that adoptions in one form or another have been around since prehistoric times. Humans are family-oriented people. In other words, humans group are always together in groups. We're social animals. And so basically, when one of the members of our group or a social complex basically it becomes orphaned for any reason, there's usually a way for that person to be adopted. There's been a lot of that's happened over forever. The question, of course, is that from a genealogical standpoint, were there records kept which would discriminate between a child born in the family and or a multiple birth or an adoption? And so that's always going to be an issue depending on the place and the time. And it helps to understand that adoption, like everything else in genealogy, needs to be understood in its historical context. You can't just pick up and say, I'm going to look for an adoption without putting it into the context of when did it occur, who were the people that were involved, what was the structure of the society, either governmental structure or social structure, whatever it was. How did the society as a whole handle adoptions? And all of those things come into play. And for the bottom line, of course, with genealogists and their research is, were their records kept? Were people specifically identified as adoptees? Were they people who, were there something that it was marked on a record of some kind that said this person was adopted from this other person or whatever? So those are the kinds of questions that are all going to depend on the historical context. Now, what I mean by historical context is the time that these events occurred. If you're talking about someone who was born in the latter half of the 21st century, the 21st century, and since in the last 25 years or so, finding an adopted parent is vastly different than looking for someone who was born in the early 1800s, for example. And finding someone who was born as an adopted person back in the 17 or 1600s may be close to very, very, not only very, very difficult, but close to impossible to determine who were the parents or whatever. And all of these are restrictions that are imposed by time and by the historical context of the person. So first of all, some kind of general historical considerations about adoptions. Number one is orphans were either adopted, and going back in time, and we're looking at the society in general around the world, orphans were either adopted by relatives, they were sold as slaves, or forced to become apprentices or indentured servants. So it depends on the society. Some societies, I know many, I could name many societies where if someone was orphaned in that society, they would be automatically adopted by family members, and they would be automatically taken care of by the clan or the tribe or the structure of the society. But as far as other societies, orphans were basically not accepted by the society, and they could become slaves or forced into some kind of indenture or apprenticeship situation rather than listening to their needs or their preferences. In many cases, the orphans could have been responsibility of the church. I'm going to give an example of that as we go along here. But the church, depending on the church records that were available, there are some countries, for instance, Sweden clearly marks births out of wedlock and identifies, and usually identifies the participants, meaning both the male and female that were involved. So it just depends on the church records. So once you get into the records and begin to see what kinds of information. Now, if you do some really good research, meaning get into looking at records as an object of your research rather than people as an object of your research, then you'll start to begin to understand what kinds of things and what the laws were and how different things were handled. There is a vast literature out there. There's just tons of documents that talk about adoptions as a subject, and also the historical basis for adoptions. So, for example, here's an example in the United States. We have what are called orphan trains, and they ran out of the eastern part of the United States back in the late 1800s and a little bit into the 1900s. Basically, that was a situation where they had orphans in the East, and they identified them, put them in all together, and put them on trains, railroad trains, and sent them across the country, and basically stopped at various locations going across the country and advertised, here's a free orphan, and you can take them into your family or use them as a farm person or whatever. And the children were then, in a sense, adopted, but they retained their identity as orphan trained children. And there were tens of thousands of these children that were sent across the country. So there's situations that, when you look at the history and the context of history, make the question of being a general question of being an orphan and whether this orphan was adopted and how the process occurred to be very, very specifically addressable. It's not something that you can say, oh, well, all orphans are like, all parish registers recorded the baptisms, or all civil registrations recorded the births. Those are the kinds of general things you can make about those kinds of records in different parts of the country and the world. But when you start talking about something like orphans, you're talking about a cultural phenomena, something that creates a situation that has to be decided by the community as such. And that's one of the bases, and I'll probably repeat this a couple of times, that the states in the United States, every single state has a different adoption law. So depending on where you are adopting a child or whether you are an adopted child from that state, the laws are different. And as far as there may have been and could possibly have been movements to try to regularize or normalize the process across the United States, but so far has not been successful. Just to kind of give a date time in the past, the first foundling hospitals in England, or they call them foundling hospitals, but they were basically to take care of the babies until they could be placed either by the church or they were put into orphanages. And of course, we have literature. Oliver Twist from Charles Dickens is an example of the kinds of things that happened in England. And that began in 1741. So this was kind of the earliest time in Western European history that orphans were addressed from any kind of a more than a family and limited area type attitude. In later years in England, they developed what were called poorhouses and the poorhouse unit. And if you want to read about poorhouses, there's a rather extensive article in the Family Search Research Wiki, and there are lots of poorhouse records. And so those poorhouse records are ways to find children who were orphaned and who were being maintained by either the parish or by the county. An adopted child may appear as a farm laborer or servant. There was a question before we got started about adopted children appearing as farm labor. Absolutely. And a lot of, I have run across this just many, many times. And in one case, someone put in added a child to one of my great-grandparents, and there was a discussion that ensued because the child was added. And then we found later records where the child said, the child herself, it was a girl, and the child herself had written a diary and a journal, and basically it was known. And she said, by no means was I ever adopted by the Tanner family. It was Tanner, one of the Tanner lines. So even though they may appear like a child, or they may appear like a farm worker or a servant, they could actually be the same. Now, the problem, of course, we have with any kind of this, any basic problem with any identification of any of these people is the names. If the surname of the parents or the mother who abandoned the child or who gave it up for adoption or whatever for any purpose is somehow known, then that's a good clue and indication of where to get to looking and starting. But like with foundlings, there were no parents at all known, and so the name that was given to the child is an arbitrary name, and the name the child lived with during their life is arbitrary. So there hasn't been any particular way. Now I'm going to talk about DNA, and DNA testing has opened up some windows to be able to resolve some of these issues, which were unresolvable in the past to some extent. So understanding that the modern forms of adoption are a new development, that they're really 1900s. They're things that happened, and a lot of the things that happened with adoptions are, I would use the term questionable. In other words, there's no real underlying intent by whoever was changing the law to always look to the child's welfare. There was always a lot of child welfare movements going on, and things like abandoning child labor and things like that. But not all the laws really acted in the best interests of the child. There was always this attempt, but it was always the courts who were making the decision, and not either one or some of the family members or those people. They were given input, but then ultimately they were not. It was not the reason of how those decisions was made. Before governments got involved, it was always primarily a family decision as to whether or not a person and where the person would be adopted and how they would be adopted, until the child was abandoned entirely, which is what we call a foundling, but it could be the child could have been abandoned at any age. And then they became street orphans, and street orphans were handled, as I mentioned earlier, either as criminals or as indentured servants, and basically were handled in that way. Now, one thing you may not have not heard and may not understand, and it's probably very important that most genealogists who are doing research in the United States should know this, have this kind of understanding of how things worked. Subsequent to around 1630, in the colonies, the American English colonies in America, England began shipping people from England, underage people, off the streets to America as indentured servants and or enslaved people and or people who were simply thrown into prison when they got to America. And these people were, we often hear the story of Australia, and that Australia was founded by English convicts. The American, the people who are here living in the colonies here simply refused to recognize that as being the same level of interest that the people did in Australia. And so that's kind of been buried back in our history. The percentage of people under the age of accountability, say 21, is kind of a ballpark figure for an age, who came to America in that fashion as indentured servants or enslaved people or transported people. Those are transported, meaning those who were convicted of some kind of infraction of the law, up to and including first-degree murder, obviously, and down to stealing a loaf of bread, as some of the folklore goes. So those people were here. The percentage of those people, it varies from anywhere from, the guesses are anywhere up to from 40 to 60% or more of the people who came to America at those time periods. The genealogists see this when they hit this, the brick wall of the person with sometimes usually a common name, or if not a common name, even an uncommon name. It just seems to appear magically in America. And so those people are very, very high probability that those people that you cannot seem to find any record of at all, or any definitive record that tells who or what they were very, very likely to be indentured, enslaved, or transported. So that's kind of the reality of the kinds of things that we have to be considerate of when we're talking about this subject. So modern adoption laws date from the first state, Massachusetts Adoption of Children Act in 1851. There's a copy of what it is. You can just look for that, Massachusetts Adoption of Children Act in 1851. And if you want to read the entire act, I don't know that would be, it would be helpful if you were doing research right around that time in Massachusetts, but probably a very narrow time frame there. And this is an emphasis at this point, that the adoption laws vary by every state in the United States and every country in the world. So unless you have an overall government that has ordered that, like, Great Britain, for example, if that's the case, but it's not really the case there either. But the country may have a uniform adoption law, but in some places, those adoption laws or customs have been relegated down even to the community level. So you have a lot of different types of situations that could occur. Now, here's the list. This is the Child Welfare Information Gateway, and it's US. And if you look for childwelfare.gov, you'll come right up with the website. And here's the links to the federal laws related to adoption and the state laws related to adoption. And basically, you can use this as a kind of a springboard to get into the complex issues of adoption in any of the US jurisdictions. Adoption law, some of the listening may know that I was a practicing trial attorney for many years, and adoption was something that you just simply never got into. There are only certain people that were certified or enabled to get into that type of practice, and it was not something that generally the legal community was, say, promoted as a specialty or whatever. But it's a very narrow area of the law, meaning there are very specific rules, very specific procedural regulations, and everything else that have to do with adoption. Now, for many years, well, since the initial time when DNA became genealogical DNA became something that people even thought about, there's been news, and they're commonly made available through the blogs and things from the larger genealogy companies who are handling DNA cases, and telling the stories of people who have found their lost family, their brother, their sister, their mother, their father, their whoever, after years and years of being apart or whatever the circumstances are. And these questions, they're very interesting to read, very emotional and sometimes very noteworthy type of situations. The other problem with these stories, obviously, is they don't tell the story where the discovery is made, but they simply don't have any, it doesn't make anybody very happy, and nobody's really going to jump up and down and go on TV to tell about it, because the people that they find are less than what they expected, or worse than they expected, or not even somebody they want to know about. So those are the kinds of problems that kind of underlie the whole issue of DNA, is you may find information that you simply did not want to know. And that may change your life, and it may change the life of other people in a way that you were not happy with. But obviously, the people who are selling DNA tests are not going to start, broadcast a lot of those stories, because that would deter people from taking DNA tests. From a general genealogical community standpoint, DNA tests are the greatest thing that's happened to genealogy in the history of the world, because we are able to solve problems that were more than unsolvable before. They were simply things that you could not even begin to guess at. And so these are the kinds of things that we would like to talk about when we're talking about DNA and genealogical research, because there are positive results from doing this research and making the type of information available. But when we understand this process, then there's a lot of groundwork that has to go along with what we're talking about. So let's kind of look and see what we're involved in. If you wanted to make a discovery, and we're not talking about, I'm going to start to build back to taking discoveries on back into the past, but any DNA type test will give you discoveries. Recently, there was with Roots Tech, there was a find your cousins or identify your relatives on Roots Tech. Whatever, I end up with 44,000 plus of these. Some even have the 80s and 90,000 relatives out there. Well, you can begin to see that finding a list of your relatives doesn't really add a whole lot to your ability to identify someone specifically. So what I'm talking about here is how we take the general concept of a relationship that we can establish scientifically through a DNA examination, and how do we turn that into really usable genealogical research. And so the first one is the DNA tests with companies that have a large online family tree collections. Now, you can get a DNA test from hundreds of companies across the United States, but the number of that have large online family tree collections is very restricted. And I'll get to that in just a moment. In addition, they need to have a sophisticated DNA matching technology. In other words, it doesn't do you or in genealogical research any good if they say, okay, this is how your percentage of certain DNA things work. But if you're not matching that out to someone else's DNA. Okay, so these are two factors that are absolutely necessary. And the third factor is you need your own family tree on the site that is doing the DNA. Okay, so let's say you have a family tree on Family Search, and you have a DNA test with one of the large DNA companies, Ancestry or MyHeritage or whoever. That's not going to do you any good, because without a family tree on that site, there's no way that even their sophisticated DNA matching technology will work. So you have to give them some kind of a basic down to earth information. Now, there is a limitation here, and that is it depends on who you're looking for. If you're looking for what we would call extremely close relative, a parent or a sibling, it's very possible that even if you just have your DNA test and they do some matches to some of the people on their database, that you would be able to find these people. But if you want to take the step further and go back in time and to see if you have a DNA match with someone who would have been your grandparent or your great-grandparent or so far back, then there are lot of more things, and the family tree then and the research becomes extremely important. And I'll try to identify how that works. Now, in case you're wondering, there are 5 in the United States, there are 5 DNA companies that have enough information to be considered to be genealogically significantly important in DNA testing. So when you're looking at these people, you have some different kind of considerations. The first one, first of all these database size are completely approximate, because the time frame of this particular chart has changed after one day after it was put up online. And Ancestry probably has lots more, and each one of these may have many, many more people. But still, relatively speaking, these are the five companies that would somehow benefit you in identifying your ancestors. And the next step of this is consider where these companies have users. Ancestry has users in mainly English-speaking world. They do have users in other countries, but their significant number of people are in the United States, Great Britain, and the other parts of the world that speak English. And 23andMe is the same. It's an American company, a US company, and that's where its emphasis is. MyHeritage, on the other hand, is a European company. It's actually based in Israel. And so, but their people that they have involved in the company are primarily in other European and Eastern European parts of the country. So depending on where your ancestors come from, and MyHeritage, for example, has a huge base in Scandinavia and other places. So the other companies are getting down to the level where the number of records is not enough to give you much of a chance of hitting the person that you're looking for. And the answer is take tests from more than one company. And if you have, for instance, MyHeritage, you could upload your DNA data from other companies into your family tree database on MyHeritage. Now, granted, most adoption issues are focused on the most recent generations. The real question usually comes up when you have the individual who is trying to find their birth parents. That's seems to me to be the most logical one. And the second one is you may find individuals who are, when they take a DNA test, find out that they didn't know their birth parents, even though they thought they did. And that is also fairly common. And then you have people who are looking for other relatives that are closer, and they're happy to find a cousin, or they're happy to find an uncle or somebody like that. but those are people that are fewer. The real emotional part of this process is when people are looking for immediate family members, siblings and parents, or children, or whatever. So this is where the DNA tests are have the most impact. But if you begin to learn about how DNA works and how it could be used to establish some other relationships and some of the tools that are being developed by the family history DNA family tree companies, then there are questions that can go back a little bit further back in time, usually with a great deal of success. Now, what about more remote adopted ancestors? There's two things, and we kind of have to, I'm going to make a distinction here because it would be another class to talk about determining whether you and someone else are descendants from a remote ancestor. Let's say you have a community where there are 6 people with the same name, and there's no really way to tell which one is which. So if you can trace the descendancy from those people, then you can identify individuals who are living today who both came from the same, or hypothetically would come from the same person, and you give them a DNA test and there are DNA matches, then that establishes the progenitor. In other words, it established the fact that this person is the person that you're looking for. So there's another factor here, and that is that you have to have other people who are potentially direct line descendants of your ancestor, and you have to get them to take DNA tests, and they have to have a family tree on the same program that you're working with. So it's kind of a yes, if you can organize that and get that working forward, then that actually works. Now, if you don't really have to go through all this, if you're looking for your parents or you're looking for your grandparents, I mean, obviously, a family tree does not. I mean, you could call it a family tree if all you had you and your unknown parent on the tree. Well, that's one way of doing things, and but that doesn't answer or address the greater issues of doing genealogical research beyond that first level step. First of all, using DNA to solve the process requires, and this is the summary of what I just said, that someone in your biological family has taken a DNA test and that the results are on one of the genealogy DNA testing and family tree websites, and that you're on the same website. So once you have that information and it's all together, now what you will find among serious genealogists who are attempting to use this DNA process is they will be recruiting people. They will the feature that we went through at Roots Tech, where they identified my relatives out to 44,000 plus or whatever, is a way to find people who are perhaps on the same program and who match up with your family tree. And now, if it's on Family Search, now Family Search has not yet adopted any specific DNA testing procedures. They have information about on the website of familysearch.org about DNA testing, but there's no way to integrate that information into what's in the family tree. That's always being talked about. And I would say that at some point in the future, that's going to be inevitable because there will be enough interest and pressure on Family Search to begin to allow people to use the tree for DNA purposes. It may be helpful for DNA purposes if you identify some relative on Family Search who is a cousin, and you figure out how you're related, and then you have the question about which of the people are you really related to, which of the ancestors is this person. That would take as when we begin to do the more research, and the more information has to be determined by what we would call the paper research, to do the actual research in the records to determine if these people are the same person, or if the information on the DNA has identified an actual connection. Let me revise that last statement. When I say established an actual connection, I mean a historically accurate connection about the individual who is the common ancestor. There's no question that the DNA tells you that this person is a cousin. What it does not tell you in every instance is how that cousin is related to you through common ancestors, unless you have a way to research back and identify through research that in fact you do have a common ancestor. So let me put that into a different kind of explanation. For instance, let's say you had a common ancestor who the DNA says was back in so many generations, like 5 generations removed or 3 generations removed or whatever. And both of you have the same 3 generation. Then if you need to be able to identify both of you need to identify the person 1 and person 2 who have taken the DNA tests and have a match and says they are cousins. They still need to go back in time and identify the common ancestor. So you both have had to have done the research back to say, yes, I'm related to this person. Oh, I'm related to that person too, because I've done the research and that's how I'm connected. See, that's how the process goes. That's how you establish that somebody back in time, besides your siblings and your parents, is your relative. Now, if you get a DNA test and it says this person is your parent, that's your parent. That's what the DNA says, and you may have a way through the program, whatever family tree program you're working with, to contact that person and try to make contact with your biological family. And this is this kind of the basis. You may need to take more than one DNA test and maintain more than one online family tree for this to work. For example, if someone has done all the research in Germany for an ancestor back 3 or 4 generations or 5 generations, and has a DNA test on MyHeritage and his or her family tree on MyHeritage, and you're on Ancestry, and you go back 4 or 5. Then, unless you happen to look on MyHeritage and see that somebody else has apparently added your ancestor and to their family tree, or that you've had to his or her, then you'll become aware that there's a question that could be resolved. And if you really want to resolve the question, you've got to do it different, at least take a DNA test and see if there's a DNA match between the 2 of you. And then when you have the information between you 2, then it makes a very, very high predictability that connecting ancestor is the one that you're related to. Now I'm going to talk about an example. This is my adoption search, and it began with a family tradition. So I'm going to, as I go through this, understand that although I'm talking about a specific example from my own personal genealogy and the history of how I came about with this answer, with this question, and how it was resolved, this applies uniformly to every other kind of similar issue. And in this case, focusing on an adopted ancestor. So, it's in other words, if I and you go back to the same person, the question is, how do we know that that person was adopted? And if we would have to do enough research at the time that the remote ancestor was living, and there'd have to be some record or some information that says we didn't know his parents before, or we knew his parents and now we don't know his parents. So this is kind of the how this will proceed. First of all, you've got to have the cooperation of family and careful research and supported DNA testing. So all of those factors. This is not something you can really resolve. Now, if you're an individual and you're looking for your parents, I'm trying to make the distinction here between the near genealogical issues, you don't really have to know anybody in your family. You may not be aware of any other relatives at all. And you can take a DNA test and find matches with somebody who says they're a near relative, and then you've got a family. But that doesn't happen if the relative is back 2 or 3 or more generations, because there's too many options. There's too many different paths back to that many people. It's the old 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256 issue. Every time you go back, the number of potential biological parents doubles. And so you have more and more choices. So the only way you understand and narrow down those choices is by doing the research, basic research. So here's the research that had been done. Okay, so this is Marinus Christensen, who is my great-grandfather. And his father and his family that we knew about was Jens Christensen and Karen Marie Johansson, and we'll talk about these in a minute. But so here's his family that was in my family tree. And this is my maternal grandmother's father. Okay, so it's not that far back. My great-grandfather, and then Jens Christensen would be my great-great-grandfather. But Marinus was born on the 10th of June of 1863 in Ledum Torslev Horing in Denmark. And he was a blacksmith by trade. And he lived in Torslev, Dronninglund, Horing, Denmark. And that's up in the little tip of Denmark that goes up towards Norway. And how do we know this? Well, this is just traditional genealogy. In fact, the information was primarily recorded in church records about the family, because this is a family that joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Denmark and then emigrated to America, to the United States, with the intention of traveling to Salt Lake City. And this was in the 1860s. The parish church, here's the picture of the parish church. So we have considerable amount of information, and we have books, and we have photographs, and we have all sorts of things that tell us who these people were, where they lived, and who they were. But the one problem that occurred was that, I'll get to that in just a second. So his parents were Jens Christensen and Karen Marie Johansson, and these are basically photographs of those two people. Now, he had 2 sisters, Marit Christine Christensen and Christine Christensen. So these were the people that of the family. And as they were coming to America, Jens Christensen and his youngest daughter died on the way to Utah. They actually contracted cholera on the Mississippi and died as they were traveling up towards the place where they would be getting off to get to winter quarters and come across the country. Oh, or later they could have been on a train, but they did come into the country through that. Marinus married Frances Ann Thomas, who was born about 1864 and died in 1950. So she was alive when I was alive. And my grandmother, Jancy Christensen Morgan, the little girl in this family. Okay, so this is Marinus when he was married and had children. Now, here's the tradition. The tradition was that Marinus was adopted. Here's a photo, reproduction of that the same old photo that I had earlier, where they have a notation on it by someone that Mary Kay Christensen's sister and brother, parentheses, adopted. So the issue here was Marinus adopted? Obviously, we didn't know. And this is the kind of thing that happens when you have cultural issues that start to intrude into the adoption process and into any other process of doing genealogy. And that is, nobody wanted to talk about it. In fact, they were upset for talking about it. And so basically, there was nothing that anybody in the family would come out with and tell us what had happened. If I asked my mother, she would have said, "Oh, maybe we don't know." I wouldn't talk about that. So it was just a forbidden subject. What that caused was an idea that perhaps Marinus was the son of one of the two daughters. In other words, they were old enough to have had children, and they were old enough to be Marinus's mother. And so, and that would not have been out of the question that maybe he was the illegitimate child of one of the sisters, and then in a sense adopted into the family or raised by the grandparents or by his sister, by his mother, without a real acknowledgement that she was the mother, at least not a public announcement about that. Okay, so those were the kinds of things. And also, as I did a lot of more research on the subject, that I found a church record that also contained a notation that he was adopted. So we had two possibilities. We had some information from the family, and then we also had a church record that says Marinus Christensen adopted. So I spent about 40 years with this issue unresolved. You can begin to obsess about some kinds of these issues and spend a lot of time on them. This was an area where all the information that I could have possibly have known about in the time over those years, I already knew about, and all the people who would have been firsthand and might have been able to explain the situation had all died, or were refusing to talk to me about it. So this is the kind of thing that happens quite frequently. So then what happened? Well, my daughter, Amy Tanner Theriot, who is an exceptional professional genealogist, found a suspected birth record for a Marinus Markusen with the same birth date in Denmark, in the exact place where Marinus and the Jensen family were living. And the Christensen family were living. So the question is, was this Marinus had the same birth date? So did he happen to be the person? And here's the information that she found. Now, how did she find this? Very simply, she looked in the parish register for Torslev, Dronning in Denmark, and looked at every single name and looked for every Marinus person born in that database. That helped. That, for example, my heritage happens to have the entire census, the entire parish register indexed, because you could do a search, see how many Marinuses there were, and see how many of them had the same birth date. There were one. So that was helpful. And so we have Marinus Markusen, 10 June 1863, 25 October 1863, Torslev Son, Dromingland Herod, alternative Lednum, Horing, Denmark, father Anton Markusen, mother Christian Marie Johansson. Okay, neither one of these are people that we had any knowledge about previous to Amy's research. So now we're looking at children in Denmark that have the same or similar names. Now, Marinus isn't particularly common, but all names in Denmark, all given names, are extremely common because of patronymics. It's Jens, Jensen, Jens, and they always name their kids Jens, and it just goes on and on. So you can see here some commonness of numbers. So the higher the number, the more common the names, actually. So it's really common. So what do we do with the existence of someone with the first given name and born on the same day? That's an interesting thing. It's just interesting from a genealogical standpoint. It's not dispositive. That means it doesn't prove anything, even if you could prove anything in genealogy, but you can't. All you can do is come to a conclusion and form an opinion. There aren't any genealogical judges out there that say, "Oh yeah, you're right. You guessed right here." So, but anyway, there's just really no way to come to that conclusion. Well, we weren't in that situation for very long because once Amy had discovered that, then there was a way to get much further, much more quickly. So we'd already had DNA tests with MyHeritage, and so we came to solve that became the way to solve the mystery. It actually happened rather automatically by MyHeritage because MyHeritage has a theory of family relativity that showed the relationship to the parents of Marinus and to Marcuson. And the person who had taken the test in Denmark, which I have left off this chart, who was related to us. And so the answer was, we have people living in Denmark who have a DNA match with us. And the only way they could have that DNA match with us is because we had a common ancestor. And this is the common ancestor. And actually, additional research on the lines indicated that this was probably the case. The issue here is the child, Marinus, his mother was unable to support him, unable to take care of him. That duty fell on the church, on the parish in Denmark, and they probably advertised or asked somebody to take the child, and that happened to be Jens Christensen and his wife. So that's what happened. So that solves the mystery. Is there still a question of whether we're related to, or that's the actual case? No, there's no longer any different. We have scientific DNA evidence that shows that that degree of relationship matches that particular family and that particular individual. So we can very much confidence go ahead. By the way, the Marcuson surname is spelled at least 4 different ways. And that's because none of these people were what you might call very literate, and they didn't spell their names the same way all the time. So you see that all the different names that we had to do. So we have several people in Denmark that are related to us. Now, how does that help us? Well, let's suppose they've done research back on this Marcuson line, which they have actually. And now that information has been incorporated into the family tree, and we have an actual biological genetic ancestral line from Marinus Christensen back into additional people in Denmark. So this is kind of the process that you would go through. One of the things we did not have to do before was find somebody to take the test. That had already been done because somebody had been found by MyHeritage and who had already taken the test and provided the information that was necessary to do it. And that's one of the other advantages of having your test done on a very large company. Solving this kind of challenge absolutely requires careful, systematic, and extensive research. Unless Amy had gone through the whole country, the whole parish register to find a possible match, and had been motivated to do that, by the way, and a well-documented family tree, unless we had no doubt that we knew that we were related to these people, to Marinus. There was no question we were descendants, that we had a descendancy from Marinus. Well, what happened with the DNA, by the way, is that the Christensen line, which was Marinus's, and Marinus's sister got married to a person with the surname Overson, who was my father's ancestor. And so my mother on the Christensen line and my father on his actually on his mother's line they were both related. They seemingly were related to each other because the genealogy showed that my father's great-grandfather and my mother's grandfather were brother and sister. But that was when we had the question about Marinus being adopted. And so my parents, all these many years when they were alive, they believed that that they were second cousins. Well, it turns out they were only second cousins by marriage. They were not second cousins by they were by adoption, they were second cousins, but they were not second cousins biologically. So that also cleared up that issue. Okay, well, that's actually what happens. That's the end of the story on that. I'm sure there's other questions that we could resolve, but the issue is this. First of all, that's one of the reasons we've set up the virtual help desk with BYU, is that if you have these individual kinds of questions, there are people at the library, many of the missionaries at the library, who are acquainted with both the DNA issues and with the research issues. So we're glad to help and answer and help you get a plan that might help you to resolve one of these questions. Now, how far back can you go? That's one of the biggest questions. 6 generations is about the limit for DNA testing in the general DNA test. If you're able to go back on either a male or a female line, then you can go back much further, but every step you go back makes it that much more difficult to find someone who has a documented family tree back to the suspect individual. Okay, thanks.